Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope that everyone is well wherever you are and that you've had a spiffing week. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the fabulous Andrew McLean for all the art that he has provided for this series since the Reclamation. Another site I'd like to mention is the Hunger Games Discord, where games are made based on your choices. Feel free to find the link for that in the description, along with plenty of other links that are related to this series. One thing before we begin, my dog Cleopatra is currently sat next to me. She needs to be in the same room as me or she gets upset. So if you hear snoring or weird bodily functions, it's not me, I promise. And without further ado, let's go! The 97th Games took place in the year 109. It had taken some time, but the youths of District 14 were now well trained for the annual reapings, and those of recent years usually passed without incident. Unfortunately this year, a few radicals were ruining the event for others by shouting for independence, but they were swiftly removed from their enclosures and dealt with by peacekeepers. Meanwhile, Atomica Perez, victor of the 96th Games, made polite conversation with the 11 Zone Chiefs, as the youths of Zone K were directed to their age fields, and once they were in their correct places, the proceedings were ready to begin. Despite having a small surgical scar on her forehead following her stay at Ravenstill Hospital, Atomica looked very presentable to both Capital and District viewers alike, as she dazzled the crowds in a yellow tulle dress that paid homage to her district. She made a brief speech that was echoed by the speakers between the fields of youths, in which she spoke about the joys of being a victor, before making her way to the female reaping bowl on the right side of the tower. After thrusting her arm elbow deep into the large reaping bowl, Atomica picked out a name, which she revealed to be 17-year-old Orla Hennessy of Zone E. The cameras immediately panned on to the second furthest field from the towers, and Ennius Dalton asked which colour, referring to the traditional colours that were worn by the youths of each zone. Eugenia Ravenstill replied that Zone E wore green and yellow horizontal stripes, which were the colours of a former county in this zone. Viewers spotted a group of girls that matched this description, who were consoling and embracing one of their own. Orla was one of the few youths with darker skin in the entire Reaping Valley, and as peacekeepers entered the field to take her, tears could be seen to form in her large brown eyes, but she smiled with appreciation at those from other zones who were wishing her good fortune in the games. Orla was subsequently escorted into the small open-roofed car that drove down the aisle towards the Reaping Tower. As is tradition, many tributes, especially those from her zone, threw flowers and sweets towards the car as it drove past their fields, and she appeared grateful to catch some of those that reached the car. After arriving at the foot of the Reaping Tower, Orla scooped up some of the flowers, before being escorted up the stairs to the main stage, where she shook hands with Atomica and the Chief of Zone E. Atomica then marched over to the male reaping bowl and, looking ahead, instead of into the bowl, she picked a name from near the top, which she read to be that of 18-year-old Ross Kinloch of Zone A. The camera quickly found a tall, good-looking young man, with a reddish tint to his brown hair and an appropriate level of stubble. As his peers offered him swigs of their whiskey, peacekeepers jumped in to stop the inebriation of this newly reaped tribute, and they swiftly escorted him to the aisle car. As it neared the Reaping Tower, Eugenia stated that Zone A's dark blue and red tartan pattern was definitely her favourite, and that Ross himself was quite the looker, although Ennius jokingly reminded Eugenia that physical beauty will get you nowhere, to which she fired back, "Sorry, Chief," with this exchange causing an amusement throughout Snow Square. Meanwhile, Ross ignored the waves of flowers and sweets that showered the car, whilst continuing to look ahead in a stern manner. Once he had been escorted up the Reaping Tower, Ross shook hands with Atomica, Orla, and the Chief of Zone A, who was heard to whisper to him to make Glasgow proud. But the peacekeepers quickly led Ross back to the front of the tower, and Atomica then ended the reaping. Orla and Ross were escorted into the cargo hold of the hovercraft that awaited them at Janssen Airport, and as it began to make its way across Zone A, the peacekeepers present reported that the pair introduced themselves and made polite conversation about their zones and home lives. Orla soon became upset as she spoke about not being able to say goodbye to her family, but Ross put his arm around her, saying that he also wished he had been able to say goodbye, but that they should do all they could over the coming week to increase their chances of seeing their families again. The hovercraft began to pass over Zone F of Ire, and the pair's mentor, Maxima Liu, victor of the 79th Hunger Games, entered the cargo hold, whilst looking at them with a curious eye. She let out a quick smile and dismissed the peacekeepers, who headed up to the main cabin, but just as Maxima looked ready to speak to her tributes, Orla asked if she was from the capital. Both tributes appeared perplexed when Maxima stated that she was from District 2, and that the previous mentor for District 14 had died from an allergic reaction the year before last. She proceeded that no other training staff had wanted this role, but after creative differences with the other mentors of her home district, she had chosen the role of District 14's mentor, as the capital had offered her a financial reward if one of her tributes won the games. As Orla and Ross digested this information, Maxima stated that this meant she had wanted them to win even more than the other mentors wanted their own tributes to win. She then asked them to step forwards so that she could examine them more closely, and after a brief hesitation, they both did so, until they were at an arm's length from Maxima. She looked the pair up and down, whilst they awkwardly looked ahead, but after a few seconds, she simultaneously punched their noses. Orla immediately shrieked and fell to the floor, whilst Ross grunted and attempted to punch Maxima in return. However, she quickly caught his hand before thrusting it behind his back and forcing him to the floor, where he yelled in pain as she pushed his face down. As Ross desperately tried to free himself from Maxima's grip, Orla calmly asked why Maxima had just punched them, to which she grinned and replied that she wanted to see how they would react to pain. As Maxima released Ross, he called her a Sassenach cow, but she helped him up and Orla also got to her feet. Maxima told Ross that she had no idea what he had just called her, but that she liked them both and wanted to invite them to join her in the main cabin upstairs. This clearly surprised the pair, but they willingly accepted this invitation. As they walked up the winding stairs, Orla asked what Maxima did to tributes that she did not like, to which she turned around and grinned, saying that Orla would not want to find out. The trio entered the upper cabin, where the peacekeepers were chatting, playing cards, and even drinking whiskey, but upon seeing the tributes, they rapidly stopped what they were doing. However, Maxima assured them that the tributes were no problem, and she sat them down on the nearest sofa as the peacekeepers gradually returned to their earlier activities. Maxima looked at both Orla and Ross once again, and Ross told her that she had better not punch them, but she simply laughed and said that she was trying to see what they needed most. As Orla raised her eyebrow in confusion at this admission, Maxima clicked her fingers at the nearest peacekeeper and asked him to put the 79th Hunger Games on the screen at the end of the cabin. She then said to Orla that she wanted to see a detailed list of how each tribute in these games could have avoided death. Orla was subsequently given some parchment, and without any questions, she began this exercise. Meanwhile, Maxima took Ross to a space on the other side of the cabin, before asking if he was wearing any underwear beneath his kilt. Ross nervously replied that they had to for the reapings, and Maxima smiled, before muttering "thank Gull for that." She said that they would practice fighting with each other, and over the next hour she taught Ross some new holds that he could use, as well as ways to see where another tribute might be aiming on his body. Ross seemed to surprise both Maxima and the peacekeepers with how quickly he was learning, and he even managed to put up a decent fight against one of them when Maxima asked them to fight. Soon after, the games ended on the screen, and Orla showed Maxima the list that she had made. She watched nervously as Maxima scanned over the list, but she seemed relieved as Maxima nodded encouragingly and told her that she had some strong ideas. Maxima looked out the window, and noticing the darkness of the sky, she asked for their dinner to be served. Before Maxima ate, she asked one of the peacekeepers to try some of her food, and after half an hour had passed and he had not become ill, Maxima finally began to eat. During this meal, she spoke to her tributes about the upcoming week, and spent time stressing the importance of looking good for the parade. She even admitted that she had punched Orla and Ross in the noses, as they were less likely to bruise than their eyes. As the evening went on, Maxima allowed her tributes a small glass of whiskey each, and they had a more casual conversation about their lives. At one point, Orla asked Maxima if she had really loved Saracen, which triggered a suspenseful gasp from the peacekeepers, but Maxima simply smiled and said that this was a good question, and that she had indeed loved him, although they both knew that they wanted to win these games, and so she had not felt guilty about killing him when the time came. Orla stared at Maxima in bewilderment at what had just been said, but Maxima asked her and Ross if either of them had other halves back home. Ross said that he liked a girl from his hunting group, but that he did not believe she liked him back, although Maxima stated that if Ross won the games, she would have no other option than to date him. As for Orla, she tearfully stated that she had a boyfriend, but that she would never see him again. Yet Maxima told Orla that she would not with this attitude, but that if she won the games, he would probably marry her. Although Orla still seemed upset, she let out a weak smile. Maxima then told the pair that it was late, and that they should head to their private quarters, so that they were ready for the next day. The next morning, Maxima made sure her tributes were looking as smart as possible, whilst reminding them that although they had not made fools of themselves during the reaping, this was their first chance to make an even greater impression. The hovercraft subsequently landed at Ravensdale Airport, and the tributes were greeted with applause as they walked down the steps of the craft and waved to the crowd. It was briefly noticed that a man was holding a sign saying, "Get 14 out," which Ross appeared to spot, and he furrowed his brow, but this man was quickly removed by peacekeepers, and the cheers continued. Once they had reached the crowd, the pair were pleased to introduce themselves and take pictures with capital citizens. Ross received several roses from female admirers, and even one male admirer, the latter of which surprised him quite a bit, but he graciously accepted this rose nonetheless. As for Orla, many citizens admired the design of her dress, and some people asked her to say simple phrases, which they recorded on various devices, while stating that they loved her accent. Orla appeared a little bemused by these recordings, but Maxima was seen to look pleased with her tribute's manners. The group took a train from the nearby Ravensdale station to Snow Station, followed by a limousine to the apartment. Ross almost fell asleep on the train, but Maxima woke him up and told him to remember that capital citizens would be much less likely to support a dreary-looking tribute. As for Orla, she marvelled at the fine designs of the Capitol buildings, and Maxima reminded her that if she won the games, she would be able to spend as much of her life within this city. The group soon arrived in their apartment on the top floor of the accommodation tower. Maxima quickly turned on the screen to see two surprisingly athletic tributes being reaped in District 11, but as Ross and Orla tried to watch, Maxima muted the screen and called the pair's stylist, Hester Cardew, up to the apartment. They were introduced to Hester, who excitedly stated that she had asked to be the designer for District 14 for as long as possible, and that she looked forward to working with them. Ross in particular seemed quite taken aback by her enthusiasm, but Orla smiled politely as they made eye contact. Hester eyed Ross and Orla's clothes carefully, while stating that she wanted to create high-fashion couture based on the designs of their zones, which they already appeared to be wearing. Orla seemed excited, but Ross appeared to not understand what had just been said. Hester called in her team of stylists, who took the vital measurements without any incidents, although Ross told one of the team to mind his nethers as he took an inner leg measurement, which produced a giggle from Orla. The team then left and produced undergarments within the design room at the other end of the apartment. As they did this, Orla looked around the apartment and admired the fine designs and ornaments, whilst Ross was clearly paying more attention to the reapings of District 10 and then 9. Meanwhile, Hester showed Maxima her 7 potential designs on a screen that was hidden from tributes, but once Maxima had narrowed down the selection to her 2 favourites, Hester suggested giving the tributes the final say, and after a pensive pause, Maxima agreed. Ross seemed to be indifferent, but he ultimately chose a sparkling tartan kilt, jacket and hat that was similar to what he was wearing at the time, except this design was embellished with sparkling stones of the relevant colours. He said it was the one he hated the least, but as Hester heard Ross say this, he stated that he never cared much about what he wore, which seemed to appease her to some degree. Orla, on the other hand, spent time carefully deciding between her 2 options, and asked for Ross's opinions, even though he nonchalantly said that she would look fine in both. Eventually, Orla chose to wear a figure-hugging gown and matching fascinator that were decorated with diagonal stripes of Zone E's yellow and green colours, which Hester was clearly excited to produce. As Hester and her team of stylists headed to the design room at the other end of the apartment, Ross was clearly more interested in the analysis of the reapings that had occurred so far. Orla's more excited expression after choosing her parade outfit soon returned to dread once more as she looked at the notes that Ross had made about the tributes that had already been reaped. He was now getting ready to write those of the female tribute for District 8, whose name was about to be announced. Atomica Perez briefly looked in amazement at the piece of paper that she had just selected, before saying that it belonged to 15-year-old Georgette Banzella. The camera hovered over the relevant section of the enclosure, but upon spotting a girl looking visibly shocked as those around her stared in her direction, Eugenia said that this must be her. The peacekeepers came in to collect Georgette, who appeared to have trouble processing what was happening. Yet as she was ushered into the aisle, Eugenia voiced her admiration of Georgette's stylish brown side-swept hair, along with the flowing velvet material that made her dress, stating that she loved its purple colours as well. However, Ennius quickly stated that it looked more pink than purple, but just as Eugenia was about to respond, Georgette arrived on the platform, where she despairingly shook hands with Atomica. Another piece of paper was taken from the mail reaping bowl, and it was announced by Atomica to belong to 12-year-old Jerzy Aramov. A short young lad with messy blonde curls and an oversized purple suit was seen to look around with an extremely worried expression. As Ennius announced, "It's the blondie." Peacekeepers entered the enclosure, and Jerzy desperately looked to the back, probably in the hopes that someone older would volunteer in his place. Yet as he was led to the platform, it became painfully clear to him that nothing like this was going to happen. He quietly cried as he shook hands with Atomica, and then Georgette. The reaping was ended by Atomica, as she wished that the odds be in the population's favour, and she, Georgette, and Jerzy were escorted into the town hall behind them. Georgette still appeared dumbstruck as she was visited by her parents and younger brother, Nylon, who cried over his sister's reaping. Georgette's parents reassured her that she would come back and to listen to her mentor, but she continued to mutter mere words at most, while staring across the room. It was only when her family were escorted out of the room by peacekeepers that Georgette cried out that she loved them, before bursting into tears. As for Jerzy, he was in floods of tears when his father arrived. He told Jerzy that his mother would have been very proud of him for being so brave, and that he should try to be as mature as possible, and not panic before or during the games. As peacekeepers came to collect Jerzy, his father begged them not to take him, but he was obviously ignored, and Jerzy was led down to the station. The AVOX present reported that as the train began its journey through the woodlands surrounding District 8, Georgette was trying to console Jerzy through his tears, but this was in turn making her more upset as well. However, he eventually managed to stop crying, and he in turn told Georgette that he was sorry as well that she had been chosen. Georgette thanked him and got up to look around the carriage as Jerzy stared out the window, but after a few minutes of relative silence, the pair's mentor, Ava Berwick, victor of the 81st Hunger Games, entered the carriage. She warmly introduced herself, and even though the tributes were surprised by her pregnancy, they politely introduced themselves back. Both Georgette and Jerzy inconspicuously dried their tears, which Ava appeared to notice, but she told them not to worry, and that it was normal for them to react this way, before asking the AVOX to fetch them each a glass of water. Ava ushered them over to the table, and although Georgette quietly sat down where she was asked, Jerzy looked like he wanted to jump through the window that lay next to him. However, Ava calmly approached him and took his hand, telling him to close his eyes and breathe. She did this herself, and even told Georgette to join in. Surprisingly, this worked, and the AVOX reported that it was strange to see the three of them in what appeared to be a respirational trance. Following this intervention, Ava convinced Jerzy to sit with her, and Georgette at the table. She proceeded to explain the key information about the coming week's events, including the arrival at the station the next day. Although Jerzy appeared to become intimidated once more when Ava mentioned the parade, she noticed his reaction, and said to both Jerzy and Georgette that as strange as it sounded, they should try to enjoy the next week, as this would reflect on the outside and make Capital viewers more likely to support and even sponsor them, which the pair both seemed to understand. Ava then ordered the AVOX to put a physical fitness tape by Ivona Jansen onto the main screen, saying that she wanted to keep Georgette and Jerzy at their physical peak, and she therefore asked them to join her in performing the exercises that were being shown. Surprisingly, Jerzy had no qualms in participating, but Georgette looked on in surprise as the pair began stretching. Yet Ava stated that if she could do these exercises whilst 5 months pregnant, Georgette could try as well. After a minute, she joined Ava and Jerzy, and as they performed sit-ups, Ava stated that they would do this every night until the games. Georgette replied that she could not do this every night, but Ava said that she would thank her later. After the half hour had finished, the darkness of night was setting in, and Ava called for their dinner buffet to be brought to the carriage. Ava initially allowed both Georgette and Jerzy to take what they wanted, but Georgette took nothing, whilst Jerzy immediately headed for the chocolate profiteroles. Ava quickly stopped them both, and said that she was testing them. She then said to Georgette that she needed to have something to eat, or she would waste away, before turning to Jerzy and telling him that profiteroles were very fattening. Ava grinned and told them to try again. This time Georgette helped herself to some fruit and salad, whilst Jerzy helped himself to some of the beef and salad. He asked Ava if he could have some profiteroles as well, which Georgette now seemed interested by, and Ava said that if they cleaned their plates, she would allow them each a small amount. This task was performed quickly by both tributes, but before Ava allowed them any dessert, she used the screen to show the other tributes that had been reaped so far, including those that had just been chosen from District 7. Although Georgette seemed intimidated by the tributes from District 11 in particular, Ava asked her and Jersey to state what the other tributes' weaknesses might be, and every time either Georgette or Jersey answered with something that Ava deemed to be a correct answer, she allowed them each a profiterole. Once they had gone through all the districts, it was relatively late, and so Ava dismissed them to their carriages. The next morning, the train waited for almost 2 hours on the outskirts of the capital, but this gave Ava plenty of time to smarten Jersey and Georgette for their entrance to Snow Station. She praised them once more for their behaviour so far, but reminded them that although they were likely to find the capital's citizens intimidating, they should remember their manners. When the train finally entered the station, Ava was the first to step onto the platform, where she smiled and waved to the bustling crowd. She subsequently introduced Georgette, who stepped down from the train and curtsied politely, as Ava had taught her, which gathered sympathetic sounds from the crowd. Ava then called Jersey down from the train, and he smiled and bowed, which gathered even more sympathetic sounds, and the crowd proceeded to surround the tributes. At first it was clear that Georgette and Jersey were both somewhat taken aback by this reception, along with the capital citizens' vivacious attitudes and clothing. Yet as they appeared to become accustomed to the camera flashes and shouts of excitement, both Georgette and Jersey relaxed, and Ava proudly looked on, as Georgette allowed several ladies to feel the texture of her dress, whilst Jersey enjoyed pulling silly faces in pictures with children of his age. Apparently wishing to end on a high, Ava took her tributes away from the station, and as they rode in the limousine to the accommodation tower, she praised them for having interacted so well with the crowd, stating that they even seemed to enjoy being in the capital, which would definitely be noticed by its citizens. Georgette replied that it felt like a blur, but Ava said that this was normal. Once they arrived in their apartment, Ava allowed her tributes to explore for the next few minutes while she sat down and rested, before asking the Avox present to give her feet a massage. Georgette slowly wandered through the apartment, clearly in awe at the fine designs and furnishings. Jersey ran around in excitement, shouting that his bedroom was bigger than his entire house back home. Ava smiled, but soon asked the tributes to come back to the table, which they eventually did. She explained that she needed to decide how to dress them for the parade the next evening. Jersey immediately rambled off a few wild ideas of his own, but Georgette shot him a look of exasperation, whilst Ava said that whilst it was interesting to hear his ideas, this was her area of expertise. She then called up her team of stylists, before asking Georgette and Jersey a little about their lives back home. Whilst Jersey was only a school student, with no apparent tailoring experience, Georgette had already dropped out of school, and although she was learning to embroider dresses, she did not consider herself an expert. As the stylist team arrived, Ava nodded and stated that she had her idea. She proceeded to sketch out 2 different designs. Jersey would wear a plain purple suit that would be covered in long needles of red, white, and blue colours, which would stick out of the outfit and form a silhouette that would enunciate his shape and slice the atmosphere. Jersey seemed bemused by this description, but before he could ask what it meant, Ava showed Georgette her design. This was a long gown of what appeared to be a massive purple measuring tape that would continually wrap around Georgette's body, with the numbers and measurements clearly shown. Georgette was bewildered when she first saw the sketch, but after staring at it for a while, she seemed to change her mind, smiling and saying that it was something different. As the stylist took the measurements, Ava sketched corresponding fascinators for each of the outfits, explaining that they were very in right now. The next evening, the parade took place as usual on the Avenue of the Tributes. As Ava finessed Jersey and Georgette's outfits, she noticed Asher Seatle, victor of the 78th Hunger Games, stood with Arlo and Honey, both from 7, by the carriage in front. Ava courteously waved at her, before quickly turning back to her own tributes and warning them to be careful of Asher, and not to accept anything that she offered them. Jersey asked why, but Ava simply told him that he did not want to find out. She also looked back to see Chief Javorsky, victor of the 87th Hunger Games, trying to talk with Waxy from 9, although she was refusing to listen to him, whilst Cornell from 9 was mindlessly stroking the horse at the front of the carriage. Meanwhile, Hester reassured Orla that she looked very nice in her yellow and green striped dress, and that she did not need to worry. Orla asked if she was sure, but Ross told her that she looked fine, and that she was worrying too much, to which even Hester agreed. Maxima then returned from inspecting the other tributes, and she assured Ross and Orla that they had nothing to worry about, just as the order was given for tributes to mount their carriages. The parade started off with a surprise, due to Shimmer and Grandess, both from 1, wearing hints of gold within their scarlet suits, while Seneca and Ignea, both from 2, wore ruffles of scarlet over their golden braces. Eugenia immediately asked if they were trying to pay homage to each other's districts, to which Ennius responded that this may possibly be the case. Jersey and Georgette each waved enthusiastically to the crowd. Although Jersey's needle-laced fascinator fell off towards the end of the parade, he and Georgette both carried on waving, and even Eugenia said that at least this had not fazed them. Ross and Orla both waved to the audience, not just to their sides, but also to those behind them, due to their carriage being at the back of the parade, which rather wisely left them as giving the last impression to most of the audience. When the tributes returned to their apartments, they watched the commentary of the parade, in which Eugenia, Ennius, and Agnes Anderson, editor of Anderson Fashion, went over their thoughts for each of the outfits. Jersey and Georgette received good reviews, and Ava was praised for her design idea, but the falling fascinator was critiqued by Agnes. As for Ross and Orla, their outfits were also well received, although Agnes mentioned that the clashing tartan of Ross's outfit, compared with the diagonal stripes of Orla's, had not gone well together. It was in fact Brace and Drifter, both from 4, who received the title of Anderson Fashion's Best Dressed, due to the luminous silver scales over their outfits that resembled fish skin, which Agnes stated that she loved. This was considered by many capital citizens to be a controversial choice, but not the worst that Agnes had made. The next day was the first of the 2 training days. Only a few minutes in, Orla seemed to be intimidated when Ignea, from 2, shot an arrow, before turning around and baring her teeth. Yet as Orla moved away and saw Georgette trying to lace 2 types of linen together in the fabric station, she approached and said that Georgette was using the wrong needle. Orla then offered her advice, and the girls spent the morning using different fabrics and building a kind of armor by weaving together thick materials that they proceeded to test by stabbing them with spears and knives. Ross spent the morning practicing in the spear station. Although he appeared slightly fazed by how accurately Seneca from 2 was throwing the spears at the targets next to him, Ross continued throwing his own and improving his aim. Shimmer from 1 came over towards the end of the morning, and Ross did not appear to hear him telling Seneca that they needed to keep an eye on the Scots guy. In the afternoon, Ross tried to convince Orla to work with him in the spear station, but she politely rebuffed his request, stating that she would never be good enough with a spear in time. She then introduced Georgette, who told Ross that she liked his parade outfit, to which he joked that it was good that at least one of them did. As he turned back to the spear station, Orla was heard to say that Ross could be like that sometimes. As for Jersey, he spent most of the first day in the camouflage station, where he at first made a mess with the different paints, yet after some more experimentation, he used them to produce a relatively decent display that covered his face into a forest background. He spent the afternoon in the plant station, where he watched Wisterio and Hydra, both from 11, who were much more able than Jersey was at identifying the toxic plants that were displayed. Even though they noticed Jersey watching them, neither of them seemed threatened by him, and they simply carried on with their practice. The next day, Orla and Georgette practiced together once more in a variety of stations that included the aquatic, toxicological, and survival stations. When they were in the survival station, Jersey joined them, although Orla seemed somewhat surprised by how much he enjoyed starting a fire. As for Ross, he initially worked in the archery station, before heading to the sword station, where he started a conversation with Antonio from 10, although neither of the boys seemed able to understand each other's accents, but this led them to simply laugh at their mutual lack of understanding. Antonio then suggested that they use a pair of wooden swords and fight against each other. Under the careful watch of Ennius Dalton himself, this went ahead, and the boys fought at a rather even level against each other, before courteously shaking hands at the end of their fight. During training, the tributes from Districts 1 and 2 were rather surprisingly training with each other, apparently agreeing to end their feud for this year. On the second afternoon, Grandess from 1 practiced backflipping across a platform while Shimmer from 1 tried to shoot her with rubber arrows. However, Shimmer did not notice Columba from 5 replacing one of the rubber arrows with a real one. Shimmer therefore shot Grandess in the leg with an arrow, which made her scream in pain, and gave her a limp until the games. Ennius had allegedly seen this, but ultimately chose not to punish Columba. The assessment of training scores occurred over the next day. At the request of the unidentified new game maker, certain details of the tribute's demonstrations were allowed to be publicized, although they were heavily edited by this game maker. It is known that the highest scorers were Shimmer from 1, Seneca from 2, and Arlo and Honey, both from 7, who each scored 10 for shows of weaponry and pure strength. Ross scored a 9 with an accurate spear and sword display, whilst Orla scored a respectable 7 with a mixed display of talents. Georgette and Jersey each scored only a 5, with what was described as a likely useless fabric creation and a futile attempt to cause arson. However, the lowest scorers of this year's lineup were Columba from 5 and the tributes from District 12, whose displays were allegedly not worth noting. When Georgette and Jersey's scores were mentioned, they each seemed disappointed, but Ava told them not to worry, and that their scores did not matter anywhere near as much as their ability to put their training into practice. She then allowed them each to have some capital cake, while she video-called her husband, Cher Cartwright. He was back home in District 8, but wished Georgette and Jersey the best of luck for the interviews, before ending the call by saying Auf Wiedersehen, which mustered a grin from Ava. Meanwhile, Maxima and Hester praised Ross and Orla for their strong scores, with Orla seeming surprised that hers was praiseworthy. However, as soon as their scores were revealed, Maxima said that they needed to focus on the upcoming interviews. She and Hester practiced asking Ross and Orla about their love lives and family situations, which seemed to unsettle the pair initially, until Maxima reminded them that these were questions they would be asked the next evening. She asked them each as well if there was a special someone back home, and after a few attempts at answering, Ross was trained to give a cheeky smile and answer that there may be, whilst Orla soon accustomed herself to hold back tears and answer that there was, and that she hoped to see him again. Maxima stated that she was content, before sending them to their rooms. The interviews occurred the next evening, and as expected, there was a lot of anticipation for the reveal of the new game maker. The career tribute surprised the audience as they started the proceedings by speaking about each other in surprisingly positive ways. Grandesse, from 1, who still had a slight limp, stated that they had the best chance of fighting together, and that life's too short for feuds. As for Columba, from 5, she also surprised the audience by stating that she did not think she would win, but that she wanted to give it her best shot, which even made Eugenia let out a bemused laugh. As Georgette entered the stage, she amazed the audience with the fine design of her purple gown, which Eugenia jokingly said that she wanted, even if Georgette survived. She stated that she had made strong alliances, and that she hoped to use them to her advantage, but when Eugenia asked what would stop these allies from turning on her, Georgette's confidence seemed to falter, and she clearly struggled to recover her confidence. However, she appeared to have made a good enough impression with the capital, and Ava was seen to nod and smile from the audience as Georgette was dismissed. During the first half of Jersey's interview, he seemed to act like he was even younger than 12 years old. He joked about the designs of the Capitol buildings, and that everything was so clean that one could eat off the streets. However, when Eugenia mentioned his opponents, and how he thought he would fare in a fight against one of the career tributes, for example, Jersey became noticeably shaken and tongue-tied. He even let out a few tears, and many capital citizens stated that the reality of the next day seemed to have hit him, although he received a respectful level of applause as he left the stage. Orla was the last female tribute to be interviewed, and she began her interview strongly, joking with Eugenia about the difference between life in District 14 and the capital, which led to Orla saying that she liked Eugenia's crack. As Eugenia raised her eyebrows and turned to the laughing audience with a bemused expression, Orla explained that this meant her humour. Amidst laughter from the audience, Eugenia moved on with a smile, asking if there was a man in Orla's life. Orla's expression quickly changed, and she replied that there was someone who she hoped to see again, whilst only a single tear came to her eye, which she swiftly wiped away. This produced sympathetic sounds from the audience, but Orla said that she would do anything to see him again, which replaced these sounds with applause, and Eugenia told her that's the spirit, before ending the interview on a high. As for Ross, he came out with the same stern expression that he had maintained for most of the past week, but as Eugenia met him with an enticing smile, she said that she bet he had a nice pair of bagpipes. Ross seemed a little uneasy for a second as the audience laughed, but he fired back that Eugenia could play them sometime if she wanted, which provoked another wave of laughter. Eugenia said that she was only talking about bagpipes, and Ross joked that so was he. The usual questions followed, and whilst maintaining his smouldering charm, Ross answered with confidence. Eugenia then asked if there was a lady in his life, and he gave a rather cryptic smile, stating that there might be one, and that if he returned home, he would let her know. This proved to be a popular answer with the audience, and the interview was ended shortly afterwards, with waves of applause. Maxima was shown in the audience, and even she looked surprised, possibly by how Ross had managed to show a warmer side to himself. The grand reveal of the new game maker took place, and as suspected by some, Anastasia Breen entered the stage. She had previously worked as a runway model for Anderson Fashion, until she changed careers to work on the games. She was also rumoured to have been one of the assistant game makers that had picked up the pieces during last year's game, which was said to make her a popular choice in the eyes of the capital, and she was now in fact the youngest game maker to date. Throughout her interview with Eugenia, Breen remained stoic, and stated that she wanted a return to form at the games, but that she felt confident about the arena and about giving the capital a decent show, which received tentative applause from the audience. The next morning, tributes were flown to the arena, then taken to their underground holding rooms, in which they were each dressed in lycra bodysuits that were silver on the sides, with their district colours on the inside. Georgia thanked Ava for her guidance, and she tearfully embraced Georgette, before saying that she was welcome. As she was about to enter the tube, Ava advised her to work with the allies that she had made, but to be careful and not over-rely on them. Jersey was also very thankful to Ava, and he gave her a card of thanks that he had written the night before. This made Ava even more tearful, and she embraced Jersey, saying that as long as he remained focused and did not let himself become overwhelmed, he could win these games. As for Ross, he was told by Maxima to think carefully about the alliances that he made, but to not trust the careers under any circumstances. Ross thanked Maxima for her guidance, and they shook hands as he entered the tube. Meanwhile, Hester reminded Orla firstly to not panic once the games began. She stated that it could be beneficial for her to work with Ross, but to split with him before the end of the games, as he would take her out if he needed. Orla thanked Hester and embraced her, before entering her tube, which proceeded to rise into the arena. This year's games took place in a tropical forest. As the podiums ascended into the arena, one of the first things that many tributes noticed was the sweltering heat, with several attempting to fan themselves as they looked around. After their eyes had accustomed to the bright lights of the sun, they were able to see that they were positioned in a clearing of smooth, flat brown mud, with a wooden cornucopia in its centre. Some tributes closely examined the area that lay behind them instead, although it was difficult for them to see past the thick borough of palm trees that lay all around the cornucopia clearing and vastly obstructed their view at the rest of the arena. Like several past arenas, this one was almost identical at all angles, with no sector in any direction from the cornucopia being vastly different in design to any other. However, tributes had no way of knowing that the thick concentration of trees surrounding the central clearing only spread for roughly 100 meters on all sides, until opening into a large open space. Within this ring of open space were plenty of small lakes, some of which contained edible fish. Whilst some lakes were only bordered by small grassy slopes, others were positioned at the bottom of long, muddy slopes, which made them easy to fall into, but hard to leave. This section of the arena therefore became dubbed the Lake Ring by Eugenia, when she and Ennius looked at the arena in more detail. As one travelled beyond the lake ring, one would encounter almost a kilometre of shallow hills that were full of thick vegetation, which maintained the warmer temperatures of the arena's centre. After traversing this area, one would reach the outer hills, that were roughly 100 metres in length and soon rose steeply towards the perimeter. The temperatures were lower in these hills, especially at night, although warmth was still maintained by hundreds of newly designed trees that were hybrids of palm and oak trees. These trees also contained coconuts towards the top of their heights, although tributes soon discovered that troops of cackling monkeys were making their way around the furthest trees to the edge of the arena. Meanwhile, back in the cornucopia clearing, there were plenty of water bottles, loaves of bread, and pieces of cheese, approximately 10 metres from the semicircular podiums along the southern side of the clearing, although the usual inclusion of fruit was not included in this year's range of supplies. Further towards the cornucopia itself were blankets and ropes that were scattered without any apparent pattern. Within these supplies, several sets of throwing knives and small bows and arrows were also hidden, although it appeared that not many tributes spotted these weapons until the games began. Most tributes seemed to be looking at the large wooden cornucopia that contained a myriad of different weapons. As the fully stocked cornucopia was shown during the initial tour of the arena, cheers were heard in Snow Square, with many citizens happy that they were about to see an epic beginning to the games once again. Ross from 14 was placed on a centre-left podium. As he looked around, he saw Georgette from 8 nervously stood on the podium to his left, but as he looked the other way, he noticed that Ignea from 2 was looking him up and down with a mischievous grin. However, Ross looked past Ignea to make eye contact with Orla from 14, who stood on a centre-right podium. He nodded reassuringly at Orla, and she let out a nervous smile, before looking at the food and drink that lay ahead of her, whilst Ross looked into the cornucopia. As for Jersey from 8, he was stood on the furthest podium to the right, with only Columba from 5 to his left. He appeared surprisingly confident, and was clearly eyeing a weapon within the cornucopia, but he failed to notice that Columba was cautiously eyeing him out of the corner of her eye. The gong sounded, and surprisingly Waxy from 9 was the only tribute to not run inwards. Being the second tallest tribute, Ross was one of the quickest, running at roughly the same speed as Ignea. Yet after passing the supplies of food and drink, Ross failed to notice Ignea snatching up a set of throwing knives that had been inconspicuously curled up within a rope. As Ross continued to run, Ignea grabbed these knives before throwing the first knife at him, but it narrowly passed his right shoulder and flew straight into a blanket that Hydra from 11 had just picked up. This did not deter Ross, and he continued to run ahead. Along with Bronx from 6, he was one of the first tributes to enter the cornucopia, where he quickly snatched a sword from the wall. Bronx grabbed a sword as well, and thrust it towards Ross's chest, but Ross pushed himself back against the western wall of the cornucopia and avoided this blade. The pair desperately tried to stab each other with their swords, as other tributes ran into the cornucopia behind Bronx, but just as he was gaining the upper hand over Ross, Grandesse from 1 fell against Bronx's back. Viewers saw that Brace from 4 had just shot an arrow at her from outside the cornucopia, which caused her to fall. This in turn unbalanced Bronx, and he was briefly distracted, which allowed Ross to slice his sword over Bronx's neck. As he was spattered by the blood of the girl from 10, Ross ran back to the south with his sword, but he swore when he noticed that Orla was about to be attacked by Honey from 7, who was running towards her with an axe. When the gong had sounded, Orla slowly ran inwards, before grabbing a blanket and running back towards the food and drink. Amidst the chaos that was going on around her, she threw as many of these supplies as possible into the blanket, then rapidly grabbed its edges and picked it up. Yet just as Orla looked around, Tanika from 12 tackled her, which caused all the supplies to fall from the blanket and onto the ground. Tanika then tried to grab the blanket herself, along with some of the supplies, but Orla got up and furiously slapped her face hard enough for her to fall to the ground. Orla gathered the supplies again and looked up, presumably in search of Ross, but as she scanned the chaos in the cornucopia, she failed to spot Honey from 7, who was running towards her with an axe. Orla turned around just a second before Honey reached her, and she instinctively cowered, but as Honey tried to bring the axe down, Orla narrowly dodged its blade. Honey quickly crawled over Orla, and she tried to force the blade into Orla's neck, but she used all her strength to push against the handle which was keeping the blade away. Fortunately for Orla, she spotted Ross running towards them with his sword, and as he came nearer, Honey breathed out in exasperation and let Orla go, before chasing after Drifter from 4, who was now running into the eastern borough of palm trees. As Ross helped Orla to her feet, she thanked him and rapidly threw some of the supplies into her blanket, before being practically dragged away by Ross towards the southeastern sector of the thick borough of palm trees. Meanwhile, Georgette from 8 had sprinted inwards when the gong sounded. She appeared to be aiming for the cornucopia, but as Shimmer from 1 ran ahead of her, she quickly seemed to abandon this idea and grabbed a blanket that lay just in front of her instead. Georgette looked up towards the cornucopia, but as she noticed Shimmer ramming an axe into the neck of the boy from 12, she sprinted to her east and grabbed a rope, before spotting Honey running straight towards Orla with an axe in her hand. Georgette instantly dropped the rope and ran southeast towards Orla, presumably in an effort to help her, but after just 2 seconds, Georgette was hit in the side of the head by a knife that was thrown by Ignea from 2, which swiftly caused her to collapse to the floor and stop moving. As for Jersey from 8, he ran straight inwards, alongside Columba. Yet while she only grabbed a bottle of water before fleeing, Jersey appeared distracted by how she had retreated backwards, but he carried on inwards. He narrowly avoided being hit with a knife by Antonio from 10, and after jumping over Arlo from 7, who was wrestling the boy from 3 to the floor, he continued towards the cornucopia. Jersey ran into the cornucopia and spotted an axe on the opposite wall next to Ross, who was fighting Bronx. Yet as Jersey was heading towards it, Seneca from 2 yanked it off the wall and looked straight at Jersey, which appeared to scare him, and he quickly fled towards the exit of the cornucopia, before tripping over Grandess's leg and appearing to hurt his hand as he hit the floor. Although Seneca seemed tempted to target Jersey, the girl from 10 ran in front of Seneca and he hit her with the axe instead. As her blood splattered against several nearby tributes, Jersey scrambled to his feet and left the cornucopia without a weapon. He then ran back to the east and appeared to be eyeing a blanket, but just as he picked it up, Drifter from 4 grabbed the other end. Jersey tried to yank it away from Drifter, but she swiftly kicked his groin, which caused him to fall to the ground, and after picking up a nearby loaf of bread, she ran off into the eastern borough of trees. Jersey desperately held his groin in pain, and after looking around to see Georgette lying motionless on the ground, he appeared to panic and ran south, straight past any supplies, until he reached the southern borough of palm trees, empty-handed but alive. Meanwhile, Ross had helped Orla into the southeastern borough, which they began to sprint through as quickly as possible, whilst carefully dodging the trees. Yet Ross suddenly stopped and told Orla to wait. In exasperation, she quietly asked him why, but he peered back from behind a tree, so that he had a view of the cornucopia, where the careers and a few surviving tributes were still fighting. Ross whispered that he wanted to see who had died, but Orla told him that they would find out at midnight. Ross quietly responded that he knew, but that he wanted to see how the careers were fighting. As he watched Shimmer stabbing the girl from 3 with a knife in front of the cornucopia, Orla whispered that she did not want them to be next. Ross nodded and they subsequently headed through the trees. The pair continued through the thick density of trees until they suddenly came to the lake ring on the other side. Ross almost ran straight onto the sloping ground that would have likely caused him to slip down to the lake below, but he quickly stopped himself, which caused him to fall on his ankle and wince in pain. However, Orla helped him up, and they soon spotted some flat ground to their left, which lay between this lake and the next. They carefully made their way over this ground before entering the shallow hills beyond. Yet as they began to traverse these hills, Ross said that he wanted to check his ankle. Orla looked around, but after not spotting anyone behind them, she agreed and ushered Ross behind a thick bush. He tried to stretch this ankle slightly, and Orla reassured him that if he kept walking, it should heal itself. Ross asked Orla if she was a healer, to which she responded that she was not, but that they could not stay where they were. Ross nodded and stated that this was fair enough, and as the pair travelled southeast, as quickly as Ross's ankle would allow, they heard 9 cannons sounding. Meanwhile, Jersey was already covered in a mixture of blood and mud as he sprinted to the south, breathing frantically and narrowly avoiding crashing into the trees of the borough. Yet when he came to its edge, he continued running into the lake ring, and before he appeared capable of processing what was happening, he was tumbling down a muddy slope, until he stopped with a loud splashing sound as he fell into the lake at the bottom of this slope. Jersey fell into this lake with such force that he only came to the surface a few seconds later, before catching his breath with a series of loud gasps. Yet as he looked around and appeared to be trying to understand how he could leave this lake, he suddenly jumped as an underwater camera showed a fish brushing past his leg. This made Jersey yelp once more, and as he quickly waded through the lake to the other side in apparent panic, and he has stated in a later replay that he would be amazed if Jersey survived more than 1 hour in the arena. Although he continued to let out panicked yelps as he waded through the lake, he eventually made it to the other side. Yet as Jersey was now covered in water, he spent the next 20 minutes continually climbing up the slope before falling back into the water below, in a rather cringe-worthy pattern which was causing continuous amusement to both Ennius and viewers in Snow Square. As for Ross and Orla, they spent the next hour climbing over the shallower hills of the southeastern sector, until they reached the outer hills that lay at the edge of the arena. They finally rested and appeared pleased to no longer be baked by the sweltering heat that emanated in the more central areas of the arena. As they ate some food and drank some water, Orla checked Ross's ankle again, which still appeared to hurt, but all she could recommend was for him to rest. However, Ross was soon distracted by the shrieks of a troop of monkeys that was passing through the trees towards the edge of the arena. Orla seemed slightly worried and whispered to Ross to grab his sword, but he remained still, and as the troop passed, he stated that they were harmless. Over the next few hours, the sunlight gradually left the arena and the temperatures lowered. Orla put the blanket around her and Ross as another cannon sounded, which was shown to viewers to belong to the boy from 5, after he was found by the careers whilst hiding in the northeastern shallow hills. He tried to run, but was swiftly caught and speared by Seneca. Meanwhile, Jersey had continued to have trouble leaving the lake. He tried a few more times, but did not even reach halfway up the slope, before slipping back down into the lake below. Yet as Jersey seemed to be about to cry in despair, He suddenly heard someone coming through the trees from the direction of the cornucopia, and he quickly submerged himself in the water. Antonio from 10 passed through the trees, but fortunately for Jersey, Antonio did not notice him, and simply carried on towards the nearest patch of grass between the lakes, which he used to head towards the shallow hills that lay beyond. However, as Jersey finally came back up to the surface and let out a quiet gasp for air, he appeared much happier than he had been before. Eugenia asked what Jersey was doing as he walked nearer to the slope, whilst appearing to try and pull something from the bottom of the lake. Yet when he reached the edge of the water, it was seen to be a small rope that ran along the centre of the lake and the adjacent slope, which he was pulling up from beneath the mud. Over the next 2 minutes, Jersey used this rope to climb up the slope. Although he fell a few times, he eventually made it to the top, before lying back in apparent exhaustion and letting out a very weak smile, whilst a sarcastic cheer sounded in Snow Square. After almost a minute of lying on his back, Jersey got to his feet and continued to head south through the shallow hills. However, due to a likely mix of the soaring temperatures and Jersey's lack of energy, he soon appeared tired and fainted behind a scruffy bush after just a few minutes of walking. 10 minutes later, the cannon of the boy from 5 sounded, but Jersey still appeared to be unconscious, and therefore he did not react. Within an hour, darkness had fully set in, and Ross and Orla kept a close eye on whatever they could see through the gaps within the trees. They heard another troop of monkeys screeching loudly as they swung through the trees and the upper hills behind them, and Orla asked Ross if he still thought they were harmless, but he replied that if they ignored them, they would hopefully not need to find out. Orla then asked Ross if he recognised these animals, and it soon emerged that neither of the pair were at all familiar with monkeys. Yet whilst they were distracted by these sounds, they failed to notice that Columba from 5 was quietly walking northeast through the hills below them. She had heard them talking as she walked, and then appeared to spot them moving within the darkness. Eugenia said that Columba would be a fool to attack or even steal from Ross and Orla, and although she seemed tempted by the pile of supplies that lay in front of them, she discreetly walked onwards. Whilst Jersey had been lying unconscious, he was also found by Columba, approximately half an hour before she came across Ross and Orla. There was a tense silence in Snow Square, as the action cut back from the bickering of Arlo and Honey, both from 7, to show Columba watching over Jersey, who was apparently unaware of the potential danger he was in. Ennius was heard to shout at Columba to kill Jersey, but Eugenia said that she would not do anything to him, before asking in a curious manner what Columba might be thinking as she stood over Jersey, but after a minute she eventually walked east towards the southeastern sector. Shortly after Columba had later passed Ross and Orla, Jersey awoke. He immediately shivered as he noticed the drop in temperature from the daytime, but as he looked around and failed to see anything, he scurried to his feet and appeared hopeless. He then walked south towards the perimeter, whilst quietly begging for some food or water from sponsors, but unsurprisingly, nothing arrived. Jersey kept a close eye for anything that could resemble food or water, before arriving at the bottom of the outer hills, where he soon curled up by the foot of a tree. He cried as he tried to keep himself warm, and whimpered that he wanted to go home. However, just as Jersey was finally beginning to fall asleep, he heard Horn of Plenty playing in the sky, and the portraits of Grandesse from 1, both tributes from 3, the boy from 5, Bronx and the girl from 6, Georgette from 8, the girl from 10, and Tanika and the boy from 12 were all shown, which left 16 tributes remaining. Ross had agreed to keep the first watch over Orla, but as the anthem played, she woke up and looked at the portraits. She breathed out in sorrow as Georgette was shown, and after noticing that Orla was upset, Ross put his arm around her and said that he was sorry. Yet she soon fell asleep once more, and Ross continued to keep watch.